U.S. Navy launches a coordinated strike on Iranian naval forces across the Strait of Hormuz simultaneously. And in 66 minutes, 3 IRGCN fast attack flotillas, Iran's primary strait mining asset, and the coastal battery that had been threatening tanker traffic for 19 months ceased to exist as operational threats. Friday, 11:31 p.m. USS Bulkeley, an Arleigh Burkes-class guided missile destroyer, Flight 2EA, running at 21 knots through the Strait of Hormuz on the westbound transit lane, received an authentication code at 11:31:17 p.m. that the Combat Information Center watch officer had been expecting since 9 p.m. Not with certainty, with the operational awareness that comes from a threat picture that has been building for 4 hours and that the ship's AN/SPY-1D radar has been tracking in full detail since the first Iranian vessel sortied from Bandar Abbas at 7:44 p.m. The Bulkeley had been the first ship to detect the sortie. It had transmitted the track data to 5th Fleet Operations and to the 2 other Arleigh Burkes destroyers in the immediate area, USS McFall and USS Porter, within 90 seconds of the first detection. All 3 ships had been at battle stations since 8:30 p.m., when the P-8A Poseidon, orbiting at 18,000 feet, had confirmed the sortie's surface composition, not the standard pattern of fast attack harassment that the IRGCN had been conducting for 19 months, but a force mix that included 2 Houdong-class missile boats carrying C-14 anti-ship cruise missiles, 1 Iran Ajr-class mine-laying vessel loaded to its operational capacity, 1 Cena-class frigate acting as the formation's command element, and 23 PACAP and Tier-class fast attack craft distributed across 3 geographic clusters positioned to obstruct both the eastbound and westbound transit lanes simultaneously. The force mix was the operational tell that had elevated the P-8's assessment from harassment to assault preparation. The Iran Ajr-class mine layer was not a harassment asset. It was infrastructure, the vessel whose employment would convert the Strait of Hormuz from a navigable waterway into a military obstacle requiring weeks of mine clearance before normal tanker traffic could safely resume. 19 months of IRGCN harassment had tested American responses to kinetic provocations. The Iran Ajr-class mine layer represented a shift from harassment to area denial, a different category of Iranian intent that 5th Fleet had assessed as requiring a different category of American response. The authentication code that arrived at 11:31:17 p.m. authorized offensive action against all Iranian naval vessels that had sortied from Bandar Abbas since 7:44 p.m. and against the Qeshm Island coastal battery that had been tracking U.S. naval vessels for 11 of the previous 19 months. The authorization was not a reaction to a specific hostile act in the 4 hours since the sortie began. It was the product of a National Command Authority decision made 73 minutes earlier after the NSC had reviewed the Iran Ajr-class mine layer's operational loading status, confirmed at 96% capacity by a satellite pass at 6:17 p.m., and assessed that a mine-laying operation in the Strait could begin before a reactive strike authorization could be processed and transmitted if the NCA waited for the first mine to enter the water. Subscribe and hit the bell. This operational depth runs here every week. The 3 Arleigh Burkes destroyers held a formation geometry that had been designed at 5th Fleet 7 weeks earlier, specifically for a straight engagement scenario. Not in response to the current sortie, but as a standing contingency posture established after the 19th consecutive month of IRGCN harassment had produced a threat assessment that rated a straight engagement operation as the highest probability Iranian escalation event in the Gulf. The formation geometry placed Bulkeley at the western strait entrance, McFall at the central channel, and Porter at the eastern approach, a coverage triangle that ensured no Iranian vessel in the strait could be outside the engagement range of at least 2 Arleigh Burkes simultaneously. The geometry had been pre-computed. The fire missions against the 28 Iranian vessels and the coastal battery had been preloaded into each ship's combat system as planned targets when the P-8's track data confirmed the sortie's composition at 9:14 p.m. The preloading meant the authentication code's arrival at 11:31:17 p.m. triggered execution rather than planning. 17 seconds after authentication, Bulkeley fired its first harpoon. What's your assessment? Type A if you believe the Iran Ajr-class mine layer's 96% loading status, representing imminent area denial capability rather than a completed hostile act, met the threshold for preemptive strike authorization. Type C if you believe the strike should have required the mine layer to begin actual mine deployment before authorization, accepting the tactical risk of the first mines entering the water during the authorization processing window. Drop your full tactical analysis in the comments. The Harpoon engagement ran in 3 simultaneous waves. Not sequential because the Iran Ajr-class mine layer was the time-critical target, and a sequential engagement that addressed other vessels first would have allowed it to begin mine deployment during the window before it was struck. All 3 ships fired simultaneously. Bulkeley's first 4 Harpoons targeted the 2 Houdong missile boats, the C-14 carriers whose engagement was essential before they could achieve a firing solution on U.S. warships. 4 missiles against 2 boats, 2 each, released at 11:34 p.m. McFall's first 4 Harpoons targeted the Sina-class frigate command element and the Iran Ajr mine layer, 2 missiles each. The mine layer prioritized to arrive before the frigate because the frigate's destruction, while operationally important, did not have a time-critical consequence that the mine layer's continued operation would. Porter's first 4 Harpoons targeted the 3 lead paycap clusters, distributing 1 or 2 missiles against the highest density concentration in each cluster. 12 Harpoons in the air from 3 ships within 31 seconds of authentication. The Iran Ajr mine layer was struck by both its assigned Harpoons at 11:43:07 p.m. and 11:43:14 p.m., 11 minutes and 50 seconds after the authentication code arrived. Both warheads detonated in the vessel's midsection. The mine layer's cargo, 96% capacity of influence mines designed for moored deployment in shipping channels, produced catastrophic secondary detonations as the Harpoon impacts initiated the mine's fusing mechanisms. The secondary detonations were visible from Bulkeley's bridge at 41 nautical miles. The Iran Ajr ceased to exist as a surface contact within 4 minutes of the first impact. No mines entered the Strait of Hormuz. The time between authentication and the mine layer's destruction was 11 minutes and 50 seconds. The NCA's assessment that waiting for first mine deployment would cost the authorization window had been correct by 11 minutes and 50 seconds. The 2 Houdong missile boats were struck at 11:42:51 p.m. and 11:43:03 p.m. The C-14 anti-ship cruise missile system they carried, a Chinese-derived weapon with a range of 35 kilometers and a 165-kilogram warhead, had not achieved a firing solution on any U.S. vessel before the Harpoons arrived. The Houdong class requires approximately 8 minutes of active fire control radar operation to achieve a valid C-14 firing solution against a maneuvering surface target. The IRGCN formation had been under P-8 surveillance since departure. The 2 Houdong boats had activated their fire control radars at 10:58 p.m., 33 minutes before the authentication code arrived, 33 minutes of fire control radar operation. Both Houdong commanders had achieved valid firing solutions against Bulkeley by 11:07 p.m., 24 minutes before authentication. They had not fired. The authorization lag that had governed Iranian tactical decision-making in previous engagements, the requirement to receive centralized launch authority through the IRGCN chain before employing strategic consequence weapons like the C-14, had prevented the Houdong crews from firing on a valid solution for 24 minutes. The centralized launch authority had not arrived before the Harpoons did. Both Houdong boats were destroyed before they received the authorization code that would have allowed them to employ their weapons. The Sina-class frigate command element was struck at 11:44:22 p.m. McFall's 2 assigned Harpoons both achieved hull hits in the frigate's aft engineering section. The frigate lost propulsion immediately and began taking water. It remained afloat and partially operational. Its communication systems continued transmitting for 37 minutes after the Harpoon impacts. The transmissions were on IRGCN command frequencies and were being collected by NSA platforms. The content of those transmissions over 37 minutes would produce 3 additional targeting coordinates: the positions of surviving IRGCN command nodes on Qeshm Island that the frigate's surviving communications officer was transmitting situation reports to, that entered the CENTCOM targeting database before the frigate's power systems failed at 12:21 a.m. The frigate sank at 12:44 a.m. The Qeshm Island coastal battery strike was executed not by the Harpoon, but by AGM-158B JASSM-ER standoff missiles carried by two B-1B Lancers that had been orbiting at 34,000 feet over the Gulf of Oman since 8:00 p.m., pre-positioned as part of the same contingency planning that had established the destroyer formation geometry 7 weeks earlier. The Qeshm battery had been active for 19 months, tracking U.S. vessels transiting the strait with its fire control radar and conducting simulated targeting runs that had been assessed by Fifth Fleet as preparation for a live engagement scenario. The battery's precise position had been fixed by a combination of commercial satellite imagery and ERA-18G passive collection runs that had mapped its radar emission geometry to a 22-meter accuracy circle 6 weeks before the engagement. The JASSM-ERs terminal guidance required no active radar emission from the launch aircraft. It flew its 930-kilometer range on preloaded GPS coordinates, activated its infrared seeker at 12 kilometers from the target, and identified the battery's specific vehicle signatures against the terrain background. 4 JASSM-ER missiles against the Qeshm battery released at 11:33 p.m. from outside Iranian airspace. First impact at 11:46 p.m. The battery's primary radar vehicle and 3 launcher systems were destroyed in the first 2 impacts. The command vehicle and its backup communication system were destroyed in the 3rd and 4th. The Qeshm battery's 19 months of continuous fire control tracking of U.S. vessels in the strait ended at 11:46 p.m. What would you have ordered as the IRGCN maritime commander at 11:47 p.m.? With the mine layer destroyed and the strait denial operation eliminated, both Houdong missile boats gone before their C-4 drones could fire, the Ajr-class command frigate dead in the water, the Qeshm coastal battery destroyed, and the 3 PACAP clusters engaged by Porter's Harpoons with 9 of 23 fast attack craft already destroyed or disabled. Order the surviving fast attack craft to execute their pre-planned harassment attack on the destroyer formation regardless of Harpoon losses, accepting that the remaining 14 craft are armed with rockets and machine guns that cannot penetrate an Arleigh Burkes hull. Attempt to vector additional IRGCN assets from Bandar Abbas or Bushehr into the engagement, accepting that P-8 surveillance will track any additional sortie from departure, and that Harpoon reloads on all 3 destroyers are in progress, or transmit a ceasefire request immediately through the Oman back channel before the second Harpoon salvo targets the surviving fast attack craft? Leave your decision in the comments. The surviving 14 fast attack craft did not execute a coherent formation maneuver. With the Ajr-class command frigate dead in the water and its communications degraded by the Harpoon impacts, the IRGCN tactical coordination that the frigate had been providing to the 3 fast attack clusters was lost at 11:44 p.m. The individual cluster commanders, each holding pre-delegated authority for their specific harassment assignments, made independent decisions. The Northern Cluster commander, whose 4 surviving PACAPs were closest to the westbound transit lane, turned south and increased to maximum speed, apparently executing the pre-planned harassment intercept of commercial traffic that the night's operation had designated as the PACAP force's secondary mission if the primary Houdong engagement succeeded. The middle cluster's 3 surviving craft turned north toward Qeshm Island. The southern cluster's 7 surviving craft turned east toward Iranian territorial waters. Porter tracked all 3 clusters' movements. The northern cluster, now on a bearing toward the westbound transit lane and toward Porter's position, was engaged at 11:52 p.m. when the cluster's lead PACAP reached 4,200 meters range and Porter's Combat Information Center assessed its bearing as consistent with a direct attack vector rather than a withdrawal. 3 rounds of 5-inch deck gunfire. The lead PACAP was hit by the 3rd round at 4,100 meters and stopped dead. The remaining 3 PACAPs in the northern cluster reversed course immediately. Porter did not pursue. The rules of engagement required assessed hostile act before continuing engagement on retreating vessels. The 4 surviving northern cluster craft cleared to the northeast. The middle cluster's 3 craft reached Qeshm Island waters without being engaged. The Southern Cluster's 7 craft entered Iranian territorial waters at 12:04 a.m. No further engagement after the territorial water boundary. The 66-minute operation produced a surface fleet assessment that differed from the previous Persian Gulf engagement in one significant operational dimension: the mine layer's destruction. The previous engagement had eliminated Iran's Gulf surface combat capability. This engagement eliminated Iran's Gulf surface combat capability again, the rebuilt force that had been assembled over the months since the previous action, and simultaneously eliminated Iran's primary strait area denial capability. Without the Iran Ajr mine layer and without the Qeshm coastal battery, Iran's ability to convert the Strait of Hormuz from a navigable channel into a contested zone requiring military clearance had been reduced to whatever mine-laying capability could be improvised from surviving assets not designed for the mission. Improvised mine-laying from small craft in the Strait's shipping lanes is detectable at slower rates than a designed mine layer, but at rates still sufficient to produce a maritime exclusion notification that would stop commercial traffic. The threat was reduced, it was not eliminated. The ceasefire request arrived at 12:09 a.m., 38 minutes after authentication, 37 minutes after the mine layer's secondary detonations had lit the horizon. It came through the Oman back channel rather than the Swiss diplomatic channel, a choice that indicated the IRGCN rather than the Iranian Foreign Ministry was originating it. The request was 4 sentences. It requested immediate cessation of U.S. naval engagement. It offered to stand down all IRGCN maritime assets within the Strait and Gulf for a period of 72 hours. It requested confirmation that the U.S. would not conduct follow-on strikes against Bandar Abbas or Bushehr naval infrastructure during the stand-down period. And it stated that any Iranian retaliation for the night's engagement would be suspended pending the U.S. response. A ceasefire request that explicitly offers retaliation suspension acknowledges in its structure that retaliation was planned, an existing response option loaded and held pending the U.S. reply rather than executed immediately. The 4-sentence structure was the IRGCN transmitting, through a civilian channel, that Iran retained options whose activation depended on the American response. The suspension was leverage: accept terms Iran could receive, and the loaded option holds, delay or decline, and it activates. The U.S. response, transmitted at 12:47 a.m., accepted the 72-hour maritime stand-down, declined to provide the assurance against Bandar Abbas and Bushehr strikes, noting that U.S. military options remained at the NCA's discretion, and acknowledged the retaliation suspension offer without committing to terms that would constrain the NCA's future authorization authority. The response was calibrated to the 4-sentence structure's implicit leverage: accept what was operationally advantageous, the stand-down, without ceding the targeting authority that the explicit non-assurance preserved. The Oman Channel confirmed mutual receipt at 12:51 a.m. The IRGCN maritime stand-down began at 1:00 a.m. No retaliation was executed in the 72-hour window. At the window's expiration, the stand-down was extended by mutual agreement for an additional 14 days, while the diplomatic framework that had been building since the previous ceasefire's conditions were transmitted moved toward its first formal session in Muscat. The 66 minutes eliminated the rebuilt Iranian Gulf surface fleet and simultaneously eliminated Iran's primary strait area denial capability. The mine layer's destruction converted what could have been a weeks-long strait closure into a 66-minute engagement. Tanker traffic resuming at 2:30 a.m., oil markets opening the following morning at a 7% price spike rather than the 29% spike when the strait had closed for 41 hours after the previous engagement. 22 percentage points of oil price stability, 11 minutes and 50 seconds of flight time. One NCA authorization transmitted 73 minutes before the first mine entered the water. The Houdong fire control radar data, valid firing solutions achieved against Bulkeley at 11:07 p.m., 24 minutes before authentication arrived, remained the most operationally unsettling number in the after-action review. Both Houdong boats had possessed the capability to fire 4 C-14 missiles at Bulkeley for 24 minutes before being destroyed. They had not fired because the IRGCN's centralized launch authority requirement for strategic consequence weapons had not transmitted authorization in time. The Centralized Launch Authority was the organizational constraint that had prevented the engagement from producing U.S. warship casualties. It was also the same constraint that had produced the autonomous missile launches in previous engagements when command infrastructure was destroyed. Centralized authority prevents autonomous escalation under normal conditions and collapses into autonomous execution when command infrastructure is degraded. The Houdong crews were under centralized authority and did not fire. Had the Cena-class frigate been destroyed first rather than fourth in the sequence, the Houdong authorization might have resolved under the pre-delegation protocol rather than the centralized authority. And 4 C-14 missiles at Bulkeley, arriving before the Harpoons reached the Houdong boats, would have been the result. The sequencing that struck the Houdong boats simultaneously with, rather than after the frigate, was the specific targeting decision that kept the 24-minute valid firing solution from becoming 4 incoming missiles. One targeting decision, 24 minutes. The difference between an engagement with no U.S. casualties and one that might not have been. Did the mine layer's preemptive destruction, converting a potential 41-hour strait closure into a 66-minute engagement, justify preemptive authorization based on loading status rather than actual deployment, or does the 22 percentage point oil price difference represent an economic rather than a military justification, whose use as a strike threshold sets a precedent with implications beyond this specific engagement? What does the Houdong crew's 24-minute valid firing solution without authority to fire, held by the same centralized authority constraint that collapsed into autonomous execution in previous engagements? Tell us about the IRGCN's command architecture as both its most effective escalation control mechanism and its most exploitable operational seam. And does the IRGCN ceasefire request's explicit retaliation suspension offer, transmitted 38 minutes after authentication, represent a genuine de-escalatory signal or a negotiating position designed to extract the Bandar Abbas and Bushehr non-strike assurance that the U.S. response correctly declined to provide? Like the video if this is the analysis you come here for. Subscribe, hit the bell, and leave your full tactical read on the 66 minutes in the comments. The next scenario is already being built.